joined today by two representatives of the Space Force. First is Colonel Mark Shoemaker. He is Vice Commander for Operations, Space Launch Delta 45. As Vice Commander, he leads a team of 15,000 Space Force and contract personnel and integrated launch and range operations. He oversees the operations and maintenance of 20 billion instrumentation and infrastructure with a 15 million square mile eastern range, and supports and tests customers with mission critical range technical and operational services. Boy, that is a mouthful. He is joined today by Colonel James Horn, who is the Deputy Director of Launch and Range Operations. Colonel Horn leads a 30-member team establishing policy, guidance, and requirements, and advocating for resources for $63 billion in assured access to space portfolio. He has commanded the 30th Range Management Squadron of Vandenberg Air Force Base, and gentlemen at GSA, I'd like you to welcome the two colonels.
Thanks, James. Dr. Neal, thank you so much for inviting us today. We are so excited to be here. We see this as the first of many conversations as we develop a collaborative working relationship going forward. I think there's a lot we can work on. The first thing I want to talk about today is the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. No Irish. And it gets to a point you made in your excellent presentation. I agreed with it across the board. Where you said we don't want to get to a point where we have a national tragedy that forces us to do all the things they're saying we need to do. Well, that's exactly what happened about 100 years ago at the beginning of our aviation journey. Newt Rockne, a national hero, internationally known, the pride of Ireland at the time, died in a tragic plane crash over in Kansas. And as a result of that tragedy, the heartfelt loss led to a national conversation about national standards, national processes, and collaboration amongst the aviation industry at large. And we don't want that kind of tragedy here or locally. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to start thinking about how we work together to evolve this industry together for not just our national good, but for the globe. As you all said, I see us at a very pivotal point in world history, and it's not unlike 100 years ago, as I just mentioned. There's a $1 trillion space economy. Apparently, it's 1.8 trillion. I had no idea when Oscar briefed that, but that's spectacular. But we see a world fast approaching, I'm sure you do too, where rockets are launching and landing multiple times a day from multiple spaceports across the nation, but also across the globe. And we see economics as an instrument of national power every bit as much, and perhaps more important in a capitalist economy like all of the countries represented here, an instrument of national power. It is in our best interest that you all are successful, just as much as it is in your best interest that we are successful to protect freedom going forward. So we want to see this industry continue to evolve. We want to see your business cases grow. We want to engage together as a federation of spaceports, working together to make sure that this industry continues to boom in a way that is beneficial for all of us across the nation and the world. Some of you asked about what is Range of the Future. If you go to the next slide, General Buck touched on this earlier, General Raymond's kind of 4 tenets in his vision is 2020. It's basically our plan at U.S. federal spaceports to evolve our infrastructure, our architecture, our business operations, policy, and with a vision towards a spaceport of the future that operates more like a port authority. That's really what it's all about. And Range of the Future is probably an unfortunate name. We're probably going to start rebranding because we believe that it springs to now. And there are so many things that we've done, and Colonel Shoemaker will probably touch on this, just to enable the current surge we're seeing in launch, which is the highest we've seen it probably since the 60s, to be honest. But there's still a lot more work to do. For those of you that are worried about money, we're not asking for more money from the appropriations. We're using existing appropriations that we have traditionally leveraged to sustain that aging infrastructure, to modernize it, and to leap forward. It is expensive to maintain the types of infrastructure that we currently and architecture that we currently maintain. So we're trying to modernize to a more modern infrastructure that enables a lot of the things that General Buck mentioned, like plug and play, and much more flexibility in how we do operations. But we don't think we're competing with it. Matter of fact, I think it's to our detriment if we do. We want to build a coalition of spaceports across the nation and working together to really advance this industry to the next huge revolutionary leaps. Here nationally, as a lot of you have touched on, we need to completely overhaul our outmoded national authorities when it comes to legislation. We're still operating in a paradigm from the 60s where 100% of launches were U.S. government. But we're now in a situation, as General Buck mentioned, where, yeah, it was 84% commercial, but honestly, even those commercial capabilities benefited the military. And if you add in the fact that our national security launches were commercially procured, it's really 100%. 100% of our launches were commercial at our federal space force. But we're still operating in a mode where commercial is allowed to operate on federal ranges in an excess capacity, when otherwise not needed for federal use. And the reality is it's completely the opposite paradigm. We have an ability to mix public and private funds. We have legislative authorities, but they're not actionable because the law says that private money has to be appropriated. No company is willing to appropriate their private equity and tie it up in the budget process. So to that end, we're taking a couple of big steps this year, and one we've been working on for a number of years. So we have a legislative proposal that we're working through the executive branch right now that would establish funds and authorities to start enabling us to mix public and private funding, to open up the throttle when it comes to excess capacity so that we're no longer operating in that old paradigm. The National Defense Authorization Act of 2022 directed a report, which we're drafting, asking for what are those legislative issues that you see and how do we fix it. And so we're writing that, and I just basically gave you the executive overview of what that report was saying. So I think there are huge partnership opportunities for us in the policy, regulatory, and legislative arena, both nationally but also broadly across the globe. But I think to take that another step forward, standards. We should not ever create a situation where you need a different rocket to launch from a different spaceport because of our interface standards and how we execute operations. Boeing and Airbus do not care where their airplanes fly from because they have the industry standards, the industry policies in effect to allow interoperability across the broad global spectrum of air. And we need to do the same on the launch side. And finally, I'll just mention a couple areas that Space Systems Command has to Launch and Range Operations Director, along with my counterparts at the 30th and 45th Space Launch Deltas, Colonel Shoemaker and Colonel Barker, we're working on. One of those is rocket cargo. Oscar, you heard his response to my question on that. But we're partnering with AFRL, the Air Force Research Labs, who's working with companies like Blue Origin, SpaceX with their Starship, and others to rapidly develop this rocket cargo capability. And our piece of that is just informing industry as they develop this commercial landscape for what our requirements are for that type of capability. But I see that as a huge, I agree with you, a huge inflection point in our industry. There is going to be plenty of business for us to share across the globe, and we'd like to partner in that area. Another area that we're also taking on this Thursday, I'm briefing the Joint Requirements Oversight Council with the Joint Staff on requirements for orbital servicing of maneuver, which is a huge growth area. Just like rocket cargo, we just want to inform the commercial business case for that and make sure our unique requirements are understood as that industry commercial business case evolves. And so that's yet another area that's going to drive further business to all of us as it progresses. I'll stop there. We wanted to set that time for questions, and I'll turn it over to my counterpart here, Colonel Shoemaker. Thanks.
Thanks to GSA for inviting us today. Really appreciate the opportunity to come talk and actually more to listen and bring in all the information that you all shared. It's much more valuable than myself. I do want to say you all have a rare experience that you've had today. You've seen in the wild 2 U.S. Space Force colonels. So we are real. And I was at the Cheez-It Bowl here in Orlando a couple weeks ago, and they did the stand up if you're active duty, you want to recognize it. So I stood up and sat down. And the guy next to me said, well, what do you do? I said, I'm in the Space Force. He thought I was joking. And he only lives an hour north of Cape Canaveral. So we've got a little branding and PR campaign to do on our end, but so please help us spread the word. It's good in many ways to get to go last because you got to hear a lot of the great inputs and perspectives that you all shared. The negative about it is I got so many notes now, and I'm getting wiser as I age, which is why I have glasses now. So if you see me doing this, it's because all my notes and scribbles from all of your inputs are tiny. But I do really appreciate everything that's been said, and I'm going to throw three thoughts out to start that kind of will weave their way through the rest of what I have to say. And they're based on inputs from a lot of you today. When we talk about spaceports, spaceports, the phrase means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And as the kind of the operations lead for sort of a spaceport, a really large spaceport that has quite a bit of throughput and demand, it means something to me that's probably different than some of you in the room today. And understanding what those differences are, I think, is going to be key as we move forward. But what's the difference between horizontal and vertical as you are operating a spaceport, and where your customer base is? Are you a small, medium, or large spaceport? And then some of us are private, some are state, some are federal, some are a little bit of what's the regional combination of those. So that shapes a lot of the conversation going forward. The spaceport to spaceport talk really interested me. And I'm really heartened by the idea and the methodology of force the policy issues out now. Because what we're experiencing right now is the exact opposite. The policy issues of high throughput, commercial, FAA license, air and space domains interacting with air and space transportations, like we're figuring it out right now. So I was really heartened by that. And then we all have to think about differentiations in terms of the services that we're going to provide in the markets that we're going to go after and satisfy the needs of those customers. And so thinking about differentiation, but with deliberate focus on commonality across all of us for the purposes of meeting our very broad collective customer base. So those kind of 3 broad things I think you'll hear as I go through here. And a lot of what I have to say is not going to be earth shattering. It's just my perspective as kind of running the large spaceport. And again, I use that phrase very loosely, spaceport. So Colonel Horn did a good job of talking through the strategic and the policy side of things. It's great to have a good work partner that is working the headquarters policy pieces and taking inputs from the one that's stuck executing and I can go, hey man, this is a real bad problem. Let's solve this problem. Go run to the Pentagon to help solve this problem. but that's a data-driven approach to that has been really beneficial over the last 6 months. He'll agree that I've been demanding customer in that regard, and especially as we work aviation coordination policies and spectrum coordination policies and financial charting policies. This is real stuff, and as I mentioned earlier, figuring it out early in a new burgeoning mission area is fantastic. So keep the charge going on that regard. So again, I'm coming from the operate the spaceport view with the rest of this. I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we believe that the spaceports globally, or for my focus more nationally, when we do an analog to airports, large airports, small airports, like how common do we need to be? Like what is going to drive our commonality? Do we think that the vertical launch companies are going to want to operate at more than 2 or 3 spaceports? Like if we do think that, then that takes us down one path. If we don't think that, that takes us down another path. And then the spaceport piece is going to also drive a lot of that as well. So I think that's a question we need to think about, because that then gets after all of us that are operating spaceports, and this mosaic of spaceport capability that we're going to put together across the United States and globally. We're differentiating the market aspects that we're all going to provide and satisfy. So the question for us all to think about, like how much does in the airport side, how much does Atlanta Airport, the best airport, need to look like? So that's the analog. So then, how much does the kind of federated Cape Canaveral, Kennedy Space Center, Space Florida structure need to look like Camden, or vice versa, or Spaceport America, or fill in your spaceport? If you can answer that question, then I think we can build out a strategy going forward. But other than through goodwill and collaboration in environments like this, like, there's something more that needs to exist. There's some institutional structure that needs to exist, I think, from a spaceport operator perspective, in order to know where I need to go next. Because otherwise it's more self-focused, selfishly driven for what I'm seeing locally. What have we done locally? Just to share a little bit about where our focus has been from a Cape Canaveral perspective, to unleash capacity, drive agility. So when I use these phrases, so capacity, how many launches can we get off in a year, or a period of time, maybe a quarter or 6 months? What's our agility? How close can we put 2, 3, or 4 T-zeros in a short period of time? How many launches can we do in 24 hours? We've said yes to 2 and 24 multiple times. So I think we have the ability to do that, but how sustainable is that? And then how responsive can we be? From the time the launch company comes to us and says, I want to launch on Wednesday, it's Monday, can we do that? Like, how do we drive towards that? So those are kind of the 3 areas that are driving our behaviors at Cape Canaveral. A lot of the way we've been able to drive our capacity up and get after the other couple of attributes is just through collaboration and cooperation. It's a great relationship we have with the FAA, with Kennedy Space Center, with Space Florida, with other DoD agencies. It's a great relationship we have with the launch companies, because in the end, we all are working towards the same goal. Maximizing the throughput, maximizing mission success, maximizing the opportunity for all actors on the range. And they're really focused on how do we get more out of the, we're not keeping the pie the same size, right? We're trying to grow the pie and give everybody a bigger slice, or at least more volume out of that pie. And we've been very successful to the last 2 years as the rates have gone up. But I think the collaboration in our current structure, our current bureaucracy, and I use bureaucracy in a positive connotation there, but it's only going to grow the pie so much. We are going to hit some point where within the current structures and the current institutions that we have, we're going to hit a limit. I don't know where that limit is, and I'm not sure we'll know that we've hit it until it's like right in front of us. But we're trying to understand what that is. So I kind of go back to the beginning of what I was talking about in terms of the problems in front of us. It's Mosaic. We need to build a spaceport across the country. The demand signal that we have for horizontal and vertical launch and spaceport to spaceport. You know, what does that future look like? What do we think that looks like? To enable the future, what needs to be done across all of our spaceports? And then what institutions need to exist, grow, or change current ones in order for us to make success. I think you got the right people started within this room, and I think, again, Dr. Lee, thank you for bringing us in to have this conversation. And I'm open to questions and thoughts, and as has been said myriad times today, you all in the commercial industry and some of the newer spaceports probably have a lot of ideas and answers in this regard. I'm all ears as we go forward. Thank you.
Any questions?
Can I ask a question, James? It's David.
Yes, of course, David.
Thank you. That was, I mean, I really appreciate the thought that you're giving to the commercial spaceports and how they can interact with Space Force in particular. And what I'm about to say may be more relevant to the general discussion, but I'd be interested in your viewpoint on this. We're obviously focusing a lot on the operational side. I guess that's your bailiwick, so that's important. But what we're seeing with Houston Spaceport and others is that the infrastructure we build around, whether there's a launch capability or an operator or not, is increasingly a bigger part of the spaceports. And Space Force, of course, I mentioned earlier in my very quick 3-minute or summary that SpaceWorks is looking to develop technologies, particularly for orbital debris and so on. So perhaps there's a way that these things can be integrated so that the Space Force, instead of thinking operations separately in the range and the different facilities, and then the support of infrastructure and R&D, and then their separate support for university partnerships. Perhaps the GSA could help with their members in the commercial spaceports, trying to integrate some of that, so that where you have the operational capabilities, you have those, but then they're supported by the partnerships with the universities and with the partnerships with local industry. And rather than sort of have this happen by accident, maybe work to make it happen in a couple of key places of just trying to integrate some of these. I don't know what your thoughts are or not, if I made much sense in saying what I was trying to say there, but as I see the Space Force developing their different capabilities, they seem to be segmented. And I think we have an opportunity here to sort of more integrate them more, and then also bring in some of these other aspects. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to get at, and I'd be interested to hear your views on that.
Thanks for that. And I would say our view on that is we agree. I think about it in terms of like the Range Commanders Council that we've operated under for years, where we coordinate across all federal DoD test ranges. That is a very mature body of professionals across that broad business space that have worked together for decades on common standards when it comes to data sharing, telemetry data streams, things like that. I understand you're talking more broadly than that. And I think leveraging bodies like this to have much more of those vigorous discussions is needed. And I would agree on the university piece. And we're starting this in the Space Force through our university partnership programs. The Space Force identified a number of universities that we now have direct relationships with to try to push the envelope in terms of STEM in particular, but deep academic thought on this entire business space, how it can function. But that's just one small subset of the very broad conversation where space is a warfighting construct, and how do we, in partnership with our global allies, protect that space for posterity.
In order to answer that further, you might mention again the interagency planning group being augmented by the academia, industry, this community, spaceports, that vision.
Right, so, and you heard Pam Underwood talk about that this morning. So we are working with her closely to bring an interagency working group to fruition. We agree with her that it needs heavy industry participation at appropriate times to guide that discussion towards the national infrastructure, national policy for how and standards for how we regulate and encourage industry. And obviously we'll pull universities into that. And we're targeting to have that first discussion, both government and industry, sometime this year, hopefully early this year, maybe next month.
Thank you, Don. One question.
If I can just follow up on that, I think we've talked about this before, but I think the government tendency would be to say, oh, yeah, we need to include industry too. And so after we have the interagency meeting and figure it all out, then we'll invite industry in to hear what they think of it. And I would respectfully suggest that an alternate approach is to engage with industry, the people who are really doing it at the beginning. That doesn't mean you have to tell all the secrets and share all the plans and say, here's the answer, and decide it in the room, but at least by engaging with industry at the beginning, then that enables the government folks to take advantage of those perspectives, those needs, those suggestions as they go off. And yes, government will need to do some things on their own, but let them take advantage of the experience and the innovation that is out there today near the beginning of that process. So I encourage you to consider that.
Yeah, George, to that point, I would say that our view is that it's industry standards of which government is a part of that conversation. We're not talking about government mill specs or mill standards that we levy on industry. It's the opposite.
Thank you. Growing on the question from Dr. David Alexander, thinking about the Space Force as possible tenants of US-based spaceports, what do you think are the opportunities to host any type of operations or equipment? Because that could be an important way to create more revenue, create more economical opportunities, and create more travel. And the second part of the question is, consider programs like the Air Force afterwards, where we can develop those type of programs at the spaceports, where we can pull companies, your suppliers in this case, to migrate in this case to the spaceport. That could be also an important part of the ecosystem, for having that home for them to develop. So that's something also that I want to put your attention. Thank you.
I have a comment and then a question. So the first comment is that in terms of industry standards, there's a group called ASTM F47, it's a Commercial Space Standards Committee organized by ASTM, that is in conformance with the OED A190, whatever directive, which encourages government participation in consensus standard products. We have a spaceport subcommittee. I'm the vice chairman, Mike L.A., astronautical national missions chairman. We have industry participation from across the industry, spaceports, less than involved, participating. So we do have a forum for spaceports consensus-based standards, and we've enjoyed spaceports participation. I know we've been seeking it, and we would love that. We have NASA, FAA, Commerce. So let me know if we can get that. The second part of the question, in the Defense Authorization Act a couple of years ago, it was encouraged by Congress that the DoD seek out resiliency through the use of commercial spaceports. Do you guys have any thoughts on that topic specifically? Please don't say no.
So on the resiliency piece, I think you're talking about some of what Dr. Neal and others mentioned about having two federal spaceports on the coast, one that's prone to earthquakes and the other potentially prone to hurricanes. You're talking about building resiliency into that business space, and we agree. I think to Colonel Shoemaker's point, you're going to see the market sort of segment and differentiate, and spaceports like airports are going to start to have certain advantages over others in certain specific areas, which is natural. If I had to forecast down the road, I would say that probably our strength since the 60s is very large rockets, vertical, but maybe not so much in the horizontal space, right? So that's an area where we build some resiliency in our ability to put things in orbit. We're emerging a very close relationship with Mars involves Ted Mercer and his group there, where we're partnering and both agree that, as Colonel Shoemaker said, at some point we're going to reach a point where we can't handle any more demand, and we need to start partnering with these other spaceports across the nation to enable increased throughput. So I think that's where we see the resilience piece. That's why it's important to us that those standards encourage commonality. So whoever, Rocket Lab, Astra, pick a rocket, whether they launch from Wallops, Kodiak, Cape, or Vandenberg, they don't have to tweak their rocket based on which spaceport they fly out of. Starships, for example, flying out of Brownsville, they're modifying pad at Kennedy Space Center. So they're going to operate out of both. We need to make sure that our standards and our policies and processes are similar. One thing I forgot to mention in my initial piece is reciprocity. Can we get to a point where a particular spaceport is the first to fly a rocket, and we accept their safety certification of that rocket, so that the company doesn't have to do it again for the company else, or vice versa? Why do you have to redo it if we've already done it? Environment, that's another great example. Space where we could cooperate well from a policy perspective to enable industry to get more bang for the buck as they build out. So I don't know if that answered your question, but those are just some thoughts I had. And yes, we would love to join your standards group. Wasn't even trying this. Thanks.
Quickly, one more comment regarding, we were talking about standards, technological and scientific standards, but from the capital markets, from the private investment sector, you have to also be very aware that the use of the ranges have already been introduced in decades to national interest programs does not distort the returns on investment of capital markets elsewhere. To give you an example, the state level, community, county level, there are private-public partnerships at play looking at building launch pads. Horizontal, always to take off. In the calculus of return on investment and return on capital point, the first comparison point is what is the alternative of the market with publicly available facilities. So when we talk about the industry leading, don't forget the capital markets, the investment community that is on the drafting board in other ranges. Bring them in the conversation, hear them out, see what the capital return needs and realities are. And when you open up partnership with the public, make sure there's a level playing field. Otherwise, in my experience, some capital providers that are a little skeptical because there's some lack of transparency due to my customer, how much is he going to pay if he goes there with a fully subsidized loan. So that segment of the industry, I recommend to bring to your conversation.
Any other questions for the two colonels, the rare side?
Well, I have a comment because I'd like to
I would like to take a shot at answering the question that was posed by Colin Shoemaker, whether we're going to be seeing the operators, are they looking at operating into different places or not? And it was answered by yourself, right? Or sorry, by Colin Warren, about the two launch pads, one in Boca Chica, of course, the Starship, and the other one in Kennedy. So I think the more the industry and the agency looks at having that universality, right? Like vehicles, the time to do proprietary gas nozzles or electrical plugs, it's long gone. That spells doom both for the agencies and for the operators. So I think if the group agrees, I think we need to move into a universal and kind of try to fit as most as possible. I know it's impossible because of the different operators, but we have also like Cornwall accepting or making a deal with the Dream Changer, Virgin Galactic, etc. So I just wanted to take a shot at answering that.
So I appreciate that answer, and I agree with you. And I think I picked the two integers I picked were probably one or two too low, but I think it'll be important to figure that out. So yes, Starship in 2 spots, Falcon 9 in 2 spots, Atlas 5 in 2 spots, Vulcan in 2 spots, big things in 2 spots. 3 is going to be interesting to see if anybody wants to go to 3 spots. 4 will be even more interesting. And then it's going to start driving questions about the commodities. Like what is the commodity? So there are key. It's interesting here. And so there's that aspect of it. There's, as we transition to different types of fuel oxidizer on future vehicles, what does that mean for the infrastructure in various locations? And what does that mean for market opportunities for providers? And to some extent, it's kind of a wild, wild west right now. I think that there's more on spec. Like I think that's where it needs to happen. If you're providing commodities, or you're trying to figure it out if you're going to build more robust power infrastructure or water supply or sewer treatment or all the other kinds of things that we have to do as a spaceport. And so the more we talk about it, and so to your point, the more we say, yep, let's agree to this. Let's just start plowing through and figuring out how to solve the policy problems now. And we'll solve with some excess bandwidth or capacity to solve policy problems, so that when reality hits, it's no more than what we planned for. Or we've at least figured out how to do something small on scale. These are all the great conversations to have. And start just laying out some stuff. And we're going to do it. Partner on statements, partner on ideas and strategies. Where our federal, state, and private spaceport objectives, strategies, common interest line.
In a specific use case to get at that, in our industry forum, we're going to have more of those, and we're going to invite all of you to those. Phantom Aerospace brought up a very interesting, compelling thought, and that was let industry define what those industry standards are for multi-use launch complex. So great. So I actually received a white paper from Mark Lester a few weeks ago. I've asked him to reach out and see if he can identify a coalition of willing in the industry space to sit down and say, all right, if a spaceport gave us a pad, what would the interface look like? How would we define it? And really start to pull that thread and define specifically based on a few existing or in design rockets what those standards would look like, and then allow that body to evolve that industry defined standard and replicate it broadly. So that's one of the concepts that we are partnering with Mark and his team and others to look at. The other interesting finding from that forum was that that's probably mostly doable in the small rocket side of the equation. Larger rockets, it gets much difficult. You've got to worry about pretty substantial and important things at a spaceport like flame bucket size, gantries, and commodities problems, air liquid nodes. with Vandenberg is substantially different than it is for smaller rockets that can roll on, roll off, and clean that. Most of them can bring their own commodities with them, or if they need them, it's a substantially small basis for and services that they require. So that's one area that we are exploring with the industry.
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation based on the opening remarks which Madam Schumacher made regarding co-sharing of space sports. I think we've talked through today's forum on public, private, and then public-private partnership. As this industry, the commercial space industry, starts to open up and kind of become more global, I think another angle which will come out, which is private-private partnership, right? So look at a scenario wherein a US private company goes into a partnership with an international private company. As a part of that understanding, that international company says you have to launch and return to a spaceport that doesn't exist today. But thanks to this partnership, you will be, right? My other passion, put it this way, is Formula One. And look at what happened recently over a period of time. And I'll just give one example of, let's say, Aramco, the largest oil and gas company, right? Who was sponsoring a lot into Formula One, happening at other places. And lo and behold, in 2021 is the first time wherein they were required to have a Formula One in Saudi Arabia, right? So it's a business model, I think, which is going to happen if such partnerships go on. What do you think is your opinion on what's going to happen? I don't know, 5 years down the road.
Okay, so let me read that. So you're talking private, US, international, and
then the space force.
and then, yeah, so
in other parts of the world.
okay. What's the question? So here's real quick what I think there are opportunities. Right? International partnerships are definitely critical to our ability to execute from a Department of Defense perspective. I think that one of the things that'll be interesting in this greater spaceport conversation is when we get into relationship, structured where Department of Defense, so again, bureaucracy in the positive sense, Department of Defense bureaucracy protects Department of Defense interests for a lot of good reasons. And so there will probably be, there could be times where those types of relationships exist for Department of Defense purposes. And there will be times where it may be more appropriate for one of your spaceports or domestic spaceports and international spaceport to be the start and stop locations for those activities. So I think we got to just go into those from a why perspective. Why are we doing something on the Department of Defense installation versus why would we do it on a NASA installation versus why would we do it on a state installation versus why would we do it on a private spaceport. And right now what I see is we're kind of the big game in town, without being egocentric. And there's a lot of entities will come to us because the prestige of operating and acting off of Cape Canaveral Space Center, and because we've got the capacity, infrastructure, and all to do it. But the question at some point is going to become, because we're either constrained or we're just constrained by adding more, adding new, or increasing the throughput. We need to have the structure in place to say, I understand what you want to do. It's an important thing to do. Your business case makes sense, but here's another place for you to go, and you can execute it with the same value and the same business structure. And it's part of our greater strategy as a nation as to why do you operate. Is that it? Okay.
Question. Back to the point about the multiple operators operating from multiple sites. It's also the other end, the receiving end. This is to the international spaceport operators. They will also have that standardization and those capabilities, those same fuel farms or whatever that's going to be needed by those particular operators as well. And so that standardization is going to go through an international domain, not just local.
Yeah, just because the other thing I want to touch on was the ecosystem. Building that ecosystem in each spaceport, nationwide and worldwide, I think is going to be critical. I talked about orbital servicing and maneuver. Another example is human transportation. We set a record this year, or last year, 2021, for number of humans in space. Or tied it. We launched 12 humans from Florida last year between GSA and something 45. So Inspiration 4 was sort of a culminating event for us in a lot of ways, because it's really the first time we've had a kind of a vigorous use case for commercial tourism in space, and how that looks different from government humans in space. And so I see a whole ecosystem just to support that aspect of it. But there's also, General Buck pointed out earlier, the whole logistics tail, if you will. If you look at from a military perspective, you've got the fighting forces in the forward edge of the battle area, but you've got this huge logistics tail behind that, supporting that entire effort campaign. And that's what you're talking about. And so it's human transportation, it's point-to-point cargo. How do you get the cargo there? Planes, ships, trains, onto the rocket, over to its next destination, and then all of the supporting infrastructure to get it from the rocket when it lands to wherever it needs to go. All of those sorts of aspects, just for that one particular use case. When you replicate that across the broad capabilities that George briefed earlier, I agree with you. I think there's a huge and burgeoning ecosystem that's probably many more times the dollar value of just the space economy. I think you're absolutely on something. We need to have a vigorous conversation about how that goes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Colonel.